From a dusty base in Afghanistan, I called home to share the news I'd been promoted to sergeant. My mother cut me off. "Is that all?" she asked. "I thought you were calling about something important, like the leaking roof." The dial tone that followed was colder than the desert wind. That night, I was no longer her daughter. I was the architect of my own disappearance, and this is the story of how I vanished. My name is Mavis Shore. At 35 years old, I was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, and the dust of Helmand Province, Afghanistan, had become a second skin. It was a fine, pale powder that coated my desert Marpat uniform, got into my lungs and settled in the lines around my eyes. Here, everything was earned in sweat and vigilance. Survival was the daily currency. The promotion to sergeant wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a testament to surviving harrowing patrols, to sleepless nights spent listening to the unnerving silence between firefights, to a sacrifice I could never quantify. It was a weight of pride I wanted to share, just once. I found a quiet corner behind a stack of HESCO barriers, a small pocket of privacy in the constant hum of Forward Operating Base Geronimo. The satellite phone felt heavy in my hand, its connection a precious, expensive tether and to a world 7 miles away. My heart hammered against my ribs with a fragile, foolish hope as I dialed the number to our small house in North Carolina. The line crackled to life. "Hello? Mom, it's Mavis." Her voice, the voice of my mother, Vivian Shore, was flat, thinned by the distance and a familiar, weary impatience. "Mavis, is something wrong?" A knot of anticipation tightened in my throat. I pushed it down. "No, Mom, something's right. I made sergeant." Silence. Not a warm, absorbing silence, but a hollow, empty one. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background, a game show host laughing hysterically. I held my breath, waiting for a single word of acknowledgement. A congratulations. A "we're proud of you." Anything. "Is that all?" Vivian finally asked, her tone dripping with annoyance. "I thought you were calling about something important." The hope in my chest shattered like glass. This is important, Mom." "Is it?" she countered, the word a slap. "Does being a sergeant help pay for this leaking roof? It's going to be a wet winter. The contractor quoted over $12,000, you know." $12,000. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the armor I'd spent years building. The pride, the sacrifice, the grit, it all dissolved into a simple, vulgar transaction. I wasn't her daughter, a Marine sergeant calling from a war zone. I was a delinquent ATM. The static on the line buzzed, and suddenly it wasn't the sound of the desert. It was the echo of a high school auditorium 18 years ago. The memory hit like a flashbang, blinding and disorienting. I was 17, standing on a brightly lit stage, my hands clammy as I accepted the North Carolina Award for Academic Excellence. My heart was a hummingbird in my chest. I scanned the sea of faces in the audience, searching for the one that mattered. I found her. My mother, Vivian, was in the 4th row. But she wasn't looking at me. She wasn't even looking at the stage. She was turned to the woman beside her, her mouth moving in a familiar, complaining rhythm. In her lap, she was flipping through a weekly sales flyer from the local Piggly Wiggly, her finger tracing a deal on canned green beans. She was talking about the rising price of gas. Her gaze never once lifted to see her daughter bathed in the spotlight of achievement. I didn't exist. The feeling was a cold, smooth stone in my gut then, and it was the same stone I felt now. The systematic invisibility, the casual erasure of my worth, had followed me from that small-town auditorium all the way to a place where a single misstep meant the difference between life and death. "Mavis, are you still there?" Vivian's voice snapped me back to the present. "Look, I have to go. My show is on. We'll talk about the roof later." The line went dead. She had hung up. I stood there, frozen, the satellite phone clutched in my fist. The desert wind whipped around me, colder than the metallic tone of the dial tone had been. But I didn't cry. The capacity for those kinds of tears had been burned out of me long ago. In its place, something else was crystallizing, a pain so deep and so old that it had finally calcified into a cold, hard clarity. There was nothing left to save, no relationship to salvage, no mother's approval to win. I looked out over the vast, brutal expanse of the Afghan desert stretching to the horizon. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, but it was honest. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was. It didn't manipulate or feign affection. It simply was. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The stars over Helmand were a brilliant, indifferent canopy of white fire in the black sky. I lay on my cot, listening to the distant drone of a generator, and made a decision. I swung my legs over the side, reached into my pack, and pulled out my waterproof Write in the Rain notebook and a pen. This wasn't an act of emotion. It was a tactical maneuver. I opened it to a clean, crisp page. Under the faint glow of my headlamp, I wrote 2 words at the top: Operation Freedom. It would be the most important mission of my life. That night, I was no longer Vivian Shore's daughter. I was the architect of my own disappearance. My plan to disappear wasn't born in the Afghan desert. It was forged years earlier, in the stifling humidity of a North Carolina Thanksgiving, at a table laden with all the trappings of a happy American family. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon hung in the air, a fragrant lie that couldn't mask the poison seeping into the spaces between us. That was the last Thanksgiving before I enlisted. My sister, Claire, the golden daughter, had arrived with her successful doctor husband and their 2 angelic children. They pulled up in a brand-new pearl-white Lexus, and my mother, Vivian, practically floated out the door to greet them. For the next hour, Vivian's voice was a constant, cooing drone of adoration. She admired my brother-in-law's car, stroked the sleeve of his cashmere sweater, and gushed over the delicate Tiffany necklace sparkling at Claire's throat. Claire was the living embodiment of my mother's aspirations. Beautiful, married to wealth, and effortlessly perfect. I was the counterpoint, the shadow that made the light seem brighter. When we finally sat down to eat, surrounded by the marshmallow-topped sweet potato casserole and the perfectly browned pumpkin pie, I made the mistake of sharing a piece of my own life. "I'm hoping to get a track scholarship," I'd said, my voice small in the face of my sister's glittering presence. "I think I have a real shot at a few state universities." Vivian waved her hand dismissively, not even bothering to look at me. "Why waste your time with all that?" she said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Look at your sister. A woman just needs to know how to choose a good husband. That's all that matters." She then turned her gaze on me, her eyes cold and assessing. "You should learn from Claire, Mavis, at least learn how to make yourself look like you have some value." A heavy silence fell over the table. My brother-in-law cleared his throat. Claire stared intently at her plate of turkey, her fork scraping softly against the china. That was the sound of my childhood, the clink of silverware against a backdrop of crushing indifference. I wasn't a person with dreams. I was a project that had failed to yield a return on investment. That night, I knew I had to escape. My escape route wasn't a university. It was an island off the coast of South Carolina. The day I stood before the iconic gates of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island, I wasn't driven by blind patriotism. I was driven by a promise, not a promise to my country, but a promise to myself. It was the promise of a place where fairness was absolute, where your worth was measured not by your mother's words, but by your actions, by your endurance, by your courage. It was a world of black and white rules, a stark contrast to the murky, manipulative gray of my family life. The brutal screamed orders of the drill instructors, the punishing physical exertion that pushed my body to its breaking point, the mud, the sweat, the exhaustion. It was all a baptism. Every grueling exercise was a way to scrub the old, weak Mavis Shore away, to replace her with a Marine who couldn't be broken, who couldn't be hurt by a dismissive glance or a cutting remark. I was building armor, plate by painful plate. I believed that the discipline, the uniform, the institution itself could be a fortress against the emotional shrapnel of home. For a long time, I thought it worked. I saw my sister as the enemy, the one who effortlessly received the love I craved. But a phone call just before my last deployment to Afghanistan shattered that illusion too. I'd called Claire to say goodbye. Her voice, usually so poised and confident, was thin and brittle. After a few minutes of strained small talk, it cracked. "He's cheating on me, Mavis," she whispered, the words choked with a bitterness I'd never heard from her before. "The perfect doctor, the perfect husband, it's all a lie." "Then leave him, Claire," I said, my voice harder than I intended. A sound that was half sob, half laugh came through the phone. "And go where? Do what? You don't understand. Mom would kill me. She needs this image, the perfect family, the successful son-in-law. It's all she has to show for herself at church on Sundays." In that moment, I understood. Claire wasn't the enemy. She was just another prisoner in the same jail, except her cell was a gilded cage. She was trapped by the same need for our mother's approval, the same fear of her disappointment. The Lexus, the Tiffany necklace, the big house, they were just the expensive bars of her prison. That realization didn't make me feel closer to her. It solidified my own resolve. I would never be Claire. I would rather be an anonymous soldier in a forgotten war than a queen in a dungeon of my mother's making. My path was my own, forged in the fires of Paris Island. But as I sat in the darkness of my barracks, the memory of that conversation lingered. The armor I had so painstakingly built felt thinner, more fragile. I had escaped the house, but I hadn't escaped the family's invisible contract. A cold question began to form in the back of my mind, a seed of doubt I tried to ignore. Could the discipline of the Marine Corps truly heal a wound inflicted by family? Could this fortress I'd built for myself ever be strong enough to withstand an attack from the one person who should have been my greatest ally? The question of whether the Marine Corps could truly shield me was answered on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon at Camp Lejeune. The air in North Carolina was thick enough to swim through, and I was in my element, running a squad of new privates through urban combat drills. I was demonstrating how to clear a room, my voice sharp and confident, when my company's first sergeant appeared at the edge of the training course. "Sergeant Shore," he barked. His face was grim. I snapped to attention. "First Sergeant, there's a Red Cross message for you. Come with me." The words hit me like a physical blow. A Red Cross message. In the military, that phrase carries an immense weight. It means death or something very close to it. It's the military's solemn, urgent way of saying your world has just fallen apart. My heart seized. Vivian. A stroke? A car accident? The thousand scenarios that flash through your mind in moments like these are always the worst ones. The privates I'd been training fell silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. As the first sergeant escorted me toward the company office, I felt the stares of my entire unit. They were looks of respect, now mingled with something else, pity. And that pity felt worse than a bullet wound. This was my sanctuary, the one place on earth where I was judged solely by my competence and my rank. Now the chaos of my other life had breached the walls. Inside the cramped office, my commanding officer, a stern but fair captain, was waiting by the phone. "We have your mother on the line, Sergeant," he said, his voice gentle. He nodded, and I took the receiver. My hand was slick with sweat. "Mom," my voice was a choked whisper. "Mavis, finally," she whined. There was no panic in her voice, no distress, just the familiar, grating tone of a grievance. In the background, I could hear the tinny, upbeat music of a daytime talk show. "The landlord is threatening to evict me if I don't have this month's rent by Friday. Can you send me $1,500 right away? I tried your regular number, but it just went to voicemail, so I had to call these people to get a hold of you." I went completely still. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. She had used the American Red Cross Emergency Communication System, a sacred channel reserved for life or death news for service members, to ask me for rent money. The world seemed to slow down. I was aware of every detail in the room, the faint scent of stale coffee, the hum of the air conditioner, the rhythmic tap of the captain's pen against his desk. And then I heard it, a quiet, weary sigh from the first sergeant standing beside me. It was a sigh of profound disappointment, not in me, but in the situation he was now forced to witness. A wave of humiliation, hot and searing as the helmed sun, washed over me. It was one thing to be my mother's personal bank account in private. It was another to have my duty, my rank, and the very institution I served be debased so publicly for such a petty, manipulative reason. She had taken the respect I'd earned and thrown it into the mud in front of the very men I led and answered to. A strange calm settled over me. It was the moment in the Bible, the one from the Gospel of John, that I'd read 100 times but never truly understood until now. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." The truth was, my mother was a black hole of need who would weaponize anything, my love, my duty, even a national support system for the armed forces, to feed her own endless drama, and accepting that truth was the only thing that could ever liberate me. "I'll handle it," I said into the phone, my voice devoid of all emotion. I hung up without another word. I turned to my CO, my back ramrod straight, my face an unreadable mask. "Sir," I said, my voice steady. "It was a false alarm." I offered no other explanation. The look in his eyes told me I didn't need to. That same afternoon, I walked into the base's finance office. I didn't wire any money. I didn't make a withdrawal. I walked to the counter and requested a change of information form. In the section for emergency contact, I took my pen and drew a single clean line through the name Vivian Shore. In its place, I wrote the name of a retired Marine gunner I knew, a man who understood honor. Then I went to the administrative office and began the formal proceedings for an early discharge from the service. The last drop had fallen. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. This was no longer a family squabble. The battle had officially begun. After filing the initial discharge paperwork, a profound, hollow quiet settled over me. The righteous anger that had propelled me through the day had cooled, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of my decision. I got in my truck and drove, not back to the sterile quiet of my off-base apartment, but towards a place on the outskirts of Jacksonville that smelled of stale beer, worn leather, and a shared, unspoken history. The VFW Post 314 was a low-slung brick building, unassuming from the outside, with a faded American flag fluttering out front. Stepping inside was like entering a different era. The light was dim and golden, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams slanting through the high windows. It was more than a bar. It was a sanctuary, a chosen family's living room. This was where I went to find Arthur. Arthur Wasalowski, a retired Marine gunner and a veteran of Vietnam, was the man whose name I had written on my emergency contact form without hesitation. I found him at the far end of the room, playing a solitary game of 8-ball under the green felt glow of the overhead lamp. His movements were slow and deliberate, the quiet, satisfying crack of the balls the only sound that broke the afternoon calm. I slid onto a worn vinyl stool at the bar and ordered a bottle of Budweiser. The cold glass felt good in my hand, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. After a few long swallows, I carried the bottle over to the pool table. Arthur looked up as I approached, his eyes framed by a deep web of wrinkles, holding a quiet, assessing intelligence. He didn't speak, just nodded toward a nearby chair, a silent invitation. I sat, and then, in a low, even voice, I told him everything. I wasn't emotional. I reported the facts, from the hopeful satellite call in Helmand to the humiliating Red Cross debacle at Lejeune, as if I were delivering an after-action report. It was the only way I knew how. I wasn't looking for pity or advice. I just needed someone who spoke the same language, the language of honor, duty, and sacrifice, to hear the unvarnished truth. I needed a witness who would understand the profound weight of a reputation being trampled, not by an enemy, but by the one person who should have fiercely protected it. Arthur listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze steady. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer a single word of empty comfort. He let my story hang in the air between us, giving it the gravity it deserved. When I finished, the silence felt immense. He slowly, methodically, chalked the end of his cue stick, the soft scraping sound filling the quiet. He leaned over the table, lined up a shot, and with a smooth stroke, sank the 8-ball cleanly into the corner pocket. The game was over. He leaned his cue stick against the wall, turned to face me fully, and finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, worn smooth by time and unfiltered truths. "You can't change her, kid," he said, his words brutal in their simple honesty. Some people, they only feel alive when they're setting fire to someone else. They need the drama. You've got two choices. You can keep letting her use you as fuel, or you can pull the plug. There is no third option. He wasn't offering a shoulder to cry on. He was giving me a battlefield assessment, a tactical reality from a man who had seen more than his share of unwinnable wars. His words weren't a comforting lie. They were a harsh, liberating truth. It was the permission I had never received, the validation I had long ago stopped asking for. Pull the plug. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order to save myself. I nodded slowly, a deep, shuddering breath escaping my lungs. "Thank you, Arthur." "Nothing to thank me for, Sergeant," he said, the use of my rank a final subtle act of respect. Driving back to my apartment, his words echoed in my mind. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. I felt purpose. I remembered a speech by Admiral William H. McRaven that had gone viral. He'd said, "If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed." A simple, disciplined act to begin the day, to create a small victory you can build on. My world had been shattered. I couldn't change that, but I could change my own. And my plan to disappear, my Operation Freedom, had to begin the same way. Not as a chaotic, emotional escape, but as a meticulously planned campaign. It had to start with the small, disciplined tasks. It had to start with me making my own bed. That evening, I didn't sit and stare at the walls. I got to work. My laptop glowed in the dark room. I went online and opened a new checking account with a small credit union based in Portland, Oregon, a state I'd only ever seen in pictures. The name sounded like a promise of rain and green, a world away from the dust of Afghanistan and the stifling air of North Carolina. I logged onto Craigslist and began posting ads for the things I wouldn't be taking with me. The bulky television, the mismatched furniture I'd bought at a thrift store, the set of Callaway golf clubs I never used. Each small action was deliberate, a quiet declaration of independence. Selling a coffee table wasn't just getting rid of furniture, it was severing a tie. Opening that new account wasn't just a financial transaction, it was laying the first brick in a new foundation, thousands of miles away. I was dismantling my old life, piece by methodical piece, building a fortress of freedom around my future. Before a soldier deploys into hostile territory, there are rituals, final checks, letters written, goodbyes said. Before I executed Operation Freedom, my own deployment into the unknown, I knew I needed one last ritual. One final desperate attempt at peace, not because I believed it was possible, but so that I could one day tell my own conscience that I had tried everything. It was my mother's 62nd birthday. Armed with a sliver of foolish hope I should have known better than to possess, I planned a surprise party. I booked a table at La Serinada, the nicest family-owned Italian restaurant in town. A place with red and white checkered tablecloths and the warm, comforting smell of garlic and oregano. I invited Claire and her family, hoping their presence would force a fragile civility. I even spent a small fortune on the perfect gift, a soft, dove-gray cashmere shawl, the kind I had once seen my mother admire in a department store catalog. It was my final peace offering, laid at the altar of a god I knew was cruel. The evening was strained from the moment she walked in. Vivian's face, instead of showing surprise or pleasure, registered only suspicion. She surveyed the cozy restaurant as if it were a trap. "This place is too noisy," was the first thing she said. The dinner was an exercise in tension. Vivian complained that her chicken piccata was too dry. She criticized the waiter for being too slow. Claire and her husband exchanged nervous glances, trying to fill the awkward silences with cheerful chatter about their children's school activities. I sat mostly silent, a knot tightening in my stomach with every passing minute. When the time came for gifts, I slid the elegantly wrapped box across the table. "Happy birthday, Mom." She took it without a word, her painted fingernails tapping impatiently on the lid. She peeled back the paper, glanced at the luxurious cashmere inside, and then, with an air of complete indifference, set the box aside on the empty chair beside her. She didn't thank me. She didn't even touch the shawl. It was just another object, another gesture, rendered meaningless by her profound apathy. Finally, the waiter brought a small tiramisu with a single candle flickering on top. Claire's husband, ever the dutiful son-in-law, raised his wine glass. "To Vivian," he said heartily, "a very happy birthday. May you have many more." We all raised our glasses. "Happy birthday, Mom," Claire and I chorused softly. Vivian surveyed her family, a strange cold smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the smile of someone holding a winning card, about to lay it on the table with devastating effect. She looked past Claire, past the grandchildren, her eyes locking directly onto mine. "Thank you, children," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the table, silencing the soft Italian music playing in the background. But the greatest birthday gift I could ever receive would be for Mavis to never appear in my life again. The air froze. Time seemed to warp, stretching the moment into an eternity. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Claire. Her husband choked on his wine, a strangled cough breaking the horrifying stillness. I watched as my sister's face crumpled, her gaze dropping to the plate of spaghetti in front of her, as if it held the secrets of the universe. She couldn't look at me. She couldn't look at our mother. She simply vanished into herself. I, however, did not look away. I kept my eyes fixed on Vivian, and in that bizarre, crystal-clear moment, the pain I expected to feel never came. There was no sting of tears, no lump in my throat. Instead, an odd Arctic calm washed over me. It was a feeling of profound, chilling relief. That single venomous sentence, forged in the deepest well of her malice, was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me. It was the truth that set me free. It was the final, undeniable confirmation that there was nothing left to salvage, nothing to fight for, nothing to mourn. It was Arthur's voice in my ear. Pull the plug. Her words weren't a curse. They were my permission slip. Without a word, I slowly folded my napkin and placed it on the table. I reached into my purse, pulled out my wallet, and laid enough cash on the table to cover the entire bill and a generous tip besides. My movements were calm, deliberate. Then I stood up. I pushed my chair in, turned my back on the frozen tableau of my family, and walked out of the restaurant. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I walked out into the cool night air, leaving the warm glow of La Serinada behind me forever. My old life did not end in a blaze of glory or a flood of tears. It ended right there, on the cracked pavement of a parking lot, with the quiet click of a restaurant door swinging shut behind me. That night, I didn't go back to my rented apartment. The woman who lived there, the dutiful daughter who always paid her rent on time, was already gone. Instead, I drove to a cheap, anonymous motel off the interstate, one of those places with a flickering neon sign that cast a sickly green glow on the cracked pavement. This was now my command post. Operation Freedom was entering its final, active phase. My tools were simple, purchased with cash from a 7-Eleven on the way, a burner phone with a prepaid SIM card, and a stack of calling cards. The cold, impersonal motel room, with its thin brown bedspread and the lingering smell of disinfectant, became my tactical operations center. With the methodical precision of a Marine disarming a complex explosive device, I began dismantling my life. Each step was deliberate, each cut clean and final, executed without emotion. First, the financial ties, the credit cards. One by one, I called the 800 numbers on the back of each piece of plastic. The Capital One card I'd had since I was 18, the Bank of America Visa, the Belk department store card my mother had insisted I get. To each disembodied voice in a faraway call center, I gave the same flat, rehearsed speech. I'm reporting my card as lost and wish to close the account permanently, effective immediately. I answered their security questions, declined their offers to reissue a new card, and listened for the confirmation. With each click of a call ending, I felt a chain link snap. Next, the local bank account, my last financial anchor to North Carolina. That was handled with an email, a formal notice to my landlord. I informed him I was vacating the premises, forfeiting my security deposit, and the final month's rent. The financial loss was insignificant. It was the price of my liberation, and I paid it gladly. Then came the smaller threads that weave a life together: the utilities, the car insurance policy, the gym membership. Every call, every email was another thread being snipped. I left no forwarding address. I wrote no letters of explanation, no dramatic farewell notes. After a lifetime of my words being unheard, dismissed, and invalidated, my silence would now be my final deafening statement. My absence would be the only message they couldn't ignore. By late afternoon, the task was nearly complete, but there was one last objective, one final piece of ordnance to deliver, not with malice, but with absolute finality. I drove through the familiar streets of my hometown as the setting sun cast long, mournful shadows across the manicured lawns. I pulled up a block away from the house I grew up in, the house where Vivian now lived alone, a queen in her quiet, lonely castle. I didn't get out and walk to the door. I didn't want a confrontation, another scene, another opportunity for her to twist my actions into a performance of her own victimhood. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about declaring a sovereign border. I walked to the simple, black metal mailbox at the end of the driveway, the one my father had installed 30 years ago. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. From the deep pocket of my jacket, I took a small plain cardboard box. Inside were 2 items. The first was the spare key to that house, a tarnished brass key I had carried on my keyring for over a decade, a symbol of a connection I now knew was a one-way street. The second was a single sheet of white paper, folded neatly. On it I had printed a single sentence, not from a poet or a philosopher, but from a 1928 Supreme Court dissent by Justice Louis Brandeis. It was a sentence that had become a cornerstone of American privacy law, and now it was my personal declaration of independence. It read, "The right to be let alone is the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most valued by civilized men." I placed the small box inside the mailbox and closed the metal door with a quiet, final click. It was done. I had returned her key. I had served my notice. The border was now established, fortified by the unimpeachable logic of the highest court in the land. The final phase began just after midnight. I sat in the cab of my old, reliable Ford pickup truck, the engine quiet. In the bed of the truck was a single olive-drab military duffel bag containing everything I owned that truly mattered: my uniforms, my discharge papers, a few well-worn books, and a thick, sealed envelope of cash. I had been slowly, secretly accumulating for years. I took one last look in the rearview mirror. The small North Carolina town was asleep, shrouded in darkness, utterly unaware of my departure. I felt no sadness, no nostalgia, only a profound, boundless relief, as if a massive, invisible weight had finally been lifted from my soul. I was a ghost leaving a graveyard. I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, a familiar, steady growl. I reached for the radio, twisting the dial until I found a station playing an old Johnny Cash song, his deep, gravelly voice singing about walking a hard line. I put the truck in drive, turned onto the main road, and pointed the nose west, towards the promise of a new sun rising over a new ocean. The 2,800-mile journey to Oregon had begun. The road unspooled before me in the steady glow of my headlights, a dark, empty ribbon leading to a life I had yet to imagine. And I have to ask, if you were in my shoes, finally free with an open road ahead, where would you go? For me, every mile I put between myself and North Carolina felt like another breath of clean, crisp air. I was finally completely on my own, and I had never felt more powerful. The drive west was a blur of cheap coffee, endless highways, and the gradual shedding of my old skin. After days on the road, I finally crossed the state line into Oregon. The air itself felt different, cleaner, cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. I followed the coastline, drawn to the raw, untamed power of the Pacific, and chose a small coastal town that felt like the edge of the world, a place where no one knew Sergeant Mavis Shore. Here I became someone new. I used my middle name, Anne, just Anne. I used my cash reserves to rent a small, weathered, cedar-shingled cabin nestled in a grove of towering Sitka spruce trees. From my porch, I could see the gray, churning expanse of the Pacific Ocean and the silhouettes of massive sea stacks rising from the mist like ancient sentinels. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded not by the judgmental silence of my mother, but by the deep, restorative silence of nature. The rhythmic crash of the waves became my lullaby. My days took on a new, quiet rhythm. I found a simple, unassuming job at a local plant nursery. The work was physical, grounding, my hands calloused and scarred from years of handling rifles and tactical gear. Now learned a different kind of strength. I learned to gently transplant delicate seedlings, to feel the richness of the soil, to nurture new life. It was a silent, undemanding job, and in its own slow way, it began to heal me, one green shoot at a time. I was no longer a weapon or an asset. I was simply a woman tending to a garden. It was there I met Ethan. He was a local carpenter, a man who seemed to be carved from the same sturdy, quiet timber as the trees that surrounded us. He had kind, steady eyes and rough, capable hands that created beautiful, functional art from reclaimed wood. He would come into the nursery to buy cedar for his planter boxes, and we would fall into easy, unforced conversations. He never pushed, never pried. He didn't ask where I was from or what had brought me to this remote corner of the country. He simply accepted me as Anne, the quiet woman who worked at the nursery. One afternoon, as I was loading bags of soil into his truck, he noticed the network of faded white scars on my forearms, mementos from the barbed wire of the Paris Island obstacle course. I instinctively tried to pull down my sleeves, a familiar shame rising in me. Ethan just looked at my hands, his gaze gentle. "Those scars tell a story," he said, his voice soft. "You don't have to tell it until you're ready." His acceptance was a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still so raw. It was a kindness without agenda, a respect without condition. It was everything I had never received from my own family. We started taking long walks on the beach after work. We rarely spoke much. We didn't need to. We walked along the tide line, our boots sinking into the wet sand, the salty wind whipping our hair. We watched the gulls soar and the waves relentlessly reshape the shore. There was a profound comfort in his silent companionship, in simply having another human being move through the world alongside me without demanding a single thing in return. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let the walls I had so carefully constructed come down, brick by painful brick. I was starting to believe I had truly vanished. I was starting to feel safe. But ghosts have a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. One evening, nursing a cup of tea in my quiet cabin, I was scrolling idly through a social media feed on an anonymous account I'd created. My finger hovered and then stopped on a post shared by a distant acquaintance from my old life in North Carolina. The preview image was a photo of a woman in a hospital bed, looking frail and wan. The headline, however, was what made my heart seize in my chest, a cold fist clenching around it. It was a GoFundMe campaign. It had been created by my sister, Claire, and the title was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. It read, "Help my mother, Vivian Shore, abandoned by her daughter while battling a critical illness." Beneath it was the picture. Vivian, looking pale and pitiful, a hospital bracelet on her wrist, and a carefully arranged look of suffering on her face. My breath caught in my throat. My quiet, peaceful world shattered into a million pieces. She hadn't let me go. She had found a way to reach across 3,000 miles and drag me back into her drama. She had taken my disappearance, my desperate bid for freedom, and twisted it into the most potent weapon of all. A public performance of her own martyrdom, with me cast as the villain. The fortress I had built was under siege. With a trembling finger, I clicked the link. The GoFundMe page loaded, and the performance began. The story, written in my sister Claire's elegant, persuasive prose, was a heartbreaking work of fiction. It painted a portrait of Vivian, a poor, frail widow, suddenly diagnosed with a rare and debilitating heart condition that required expensive, life-saving surgery. It then spoke of her youngest daughter, Mavis, a former Marine who had vanished without a trace, abandoning her ailing mother in her darkest hour. My disappearance was no longer an escape. It was an act of monstrous cruelty. My stomach churned as I scrolled down. The post had been shared hundreds of times. The comments section was a torrent of misplaced sympathy and righteous fury. "Praying for you, Vivian. Stay strong," one wrote. "I can't believe a daughter, especially one who served our country, could be so heartless. Shame on her," wrote another. "We're all your children now. God bless you." They were strangers, judging a person they didn't know based on a story they couldn't verify. And they were opening their wallets. The little progress bar showed they had already raised over $20,000. A wave of nausea washed over me. I knew my mother wasn't critically ill. She had, at worst, a minor heart palpitation, the kind that could be managed with a low-dose beta blocker. This wasn't a medical crisis. It was her grandest performance yet, a masterclass in emotional manipulation. And she had enlisted my sister as her co-star. My phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the wooden floor. I buried my face in my hands, a dry, ragged sob catching in my throat. The fortress I'd built in Oregon had been breached. The peace I'd so carefully cultivated was a fragile illusion. They had found a way to hurt me from 3,000 miles away, turning my silence into a confession of guilt. Ethan found me like that, curled up on the small rug, shaking. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat on the floor beside me, a large, solid presence in the chaos of my mind. When I finally managed to push the phone towards him and explain, my voice cracking, he didn't offer empty advice. He didn't tell me to call and scream at them, or to post my side of the story. He simply wrapped his strong arms around me, pulling me into a hug that felt like an anchor. "They don't know you, Anne," he whispered into my hair. "I know you." Those 6 simple words were a lifeline. They pulled me back from the brink. He was right. Their words, their lies, were outside events. They couldn't touch the person I was, the truth I knew. My training, both in the Corps and in my own quiet study, came flooding back. I remembered the words of the Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. I couldn't control my mother's lies. I couldn't control Claire's complicity or the opinions of hundreds of strangers on the internet. But I could control my response. My breathing steadied. The shaking stopped. I pulled away from Ethan and sat up straight, my spine stiffening. The victim vanished, and the sergeant returned. This was not a family drama to be won with tears or shouting matches. This was an information war. And I would not win by engaging in their theater of lies. I would win with a single, irrefutable, strategically deployed truth. I wouldn't contact Vivian. I wouldn't contact Claire. That would be playing their game. Instead, I opened my laptop. My target was not my mother or my sister. It was my brother-in-law. The successful, respected doctor whose reputation was inextricably linked to his wife's actions. He was the weak point in their fortress. I composed a new email. It was short, cold, and professional. To Dr. Mark Collins. Subject regarding your wife's GoFundMe campaign. The body of the email contained no text, no accusations, no explanations, no emotion. There was only a single attachment. It was a high-resolution scan of the note I had left in my mother's mailbox. The elegant, powerful words of Justice Louis Brandeis, clear as day. The right to be let alone is the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized men. My name wasn't on it. There was no signature, but he would know exactly who it came from. He would understand the implication instantly. He, a man whose entire career was built on ethics and public trust, was now tied to a fraudulent fundraising campaign. He would realize that his wife's participation in this public deception was a liability that could potentially destroy everything he had worked for. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the mouse. This was it. The point of no return. This was not a plea for understanding. This was a surgical strike. I clicked send. The email vanished into the ether, a silent digital torpedo aimed directly at the heart of their operation. I had just lit the fuse on a time bomb in the middle of their perfect, curated lives. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. The silence after I sent the email was deafening. For 3 days, I went about my life in a state of suspended animation, my phone feeling like a dormant explosive in my pocket. I worked at the nursery, my hands tending to ferns and hydrangeas, while my mind was thousands of miles away, waiting for the aftershocks. On the 4th day, they came. Not as a direct explosion, but as a tremor from the past. A message popped up on the old, dormant social media account I hadn't deleted. It was from a high school acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Hey Mavis, crazy stuff going on back home, the message read. That GoFundMe for your mom disappeared overnight. Heard your brother-in-law went ballistic. My breath hitched. The message continued. A second-hand report from the blast zone. Mark, the good doctor, had apparently discovered that Vivian's rare heart condition was nothing more than a minor arrhythmia, something she'd had for years. The fraudulent campaign, which he had unknowingly contributed to, was exposed. He and Claire had a spectacular fight, and he had threatened divorce if she didn't shut down the entire charade immediately. The house of cards had collapsed, Vivian, stripped of her public sympathy, and, more importantly, her access to her son-in-law's wealth, had been defeated. I read the message twice, then a third time. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a satisfying rush of victory, but there was nothing, only a profound, hollow emptiness. I had won. but it didn't feel like winning. It just felt over. The war was over, and all that was left was the quiet, desolate landscape of a broken family. A month later, a piece of the wreckage washed up on my shore. A letter, forwarded from my old address, arrived at my small post office box. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably my mother's. For a moment, a flicker of some old, ingrained instinct made me want to throw it away unopened. But I knew I had to see it through to the end. The letter was not an apology. It was a final salvo of venom. 4 pages of spidery, enraged script, accusing me of ruining her life, of being a poisonous snake, of turning her own daughter against her. It was a masterwork of blame-shifting and self-pity. But it was the final paragraph that caught my attention. It was the crux of the entire letter, the one shard of truth buried in a mountain of lies. "You won, Mavis," she wrote. "You took everything from me. I hope you're happy with your selfishness." It was a bitter, spiteful concession wrapped in the poison of guilt. It was her last-ditch effort to make me feel responsible for her misery. But reading it, I felt a strange sense of detachment. The words no longer had the power to wound me. They were just ink on paper, the final desperate gasps of a manipulator who had lost her power. She wasn't just admitting defeat, she was releasing me from any lingering subconscious obligation to fix her. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I didn't need to respond. The conversation was over. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent into the Pacific, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, I took the letter down to the beach. Ethan walked beside me, his presence a quiet, steady comfort. He didn't ask what was in the letter. He seemed to understand that this was a ceremony I had to perform alone. I sat on a piece of driftwood, the cool, salty air on my face. Ethan took a small, weathered piece of cedar from his pocket, and with a few deft folds, fashioned it into a simple, beautiful little boat. He handed it to me without a word. My hands were steady as I took my mother's letter from my pocket. I folded the 4 pages of angry words into a tight, dense square and tucked it securely into the hull of the tiny wooden vessel. I was entrusting the last remnants of my past to this small, sturdy craft. I walked to the water's edge, the cold foam of a receding wave washing over the toes of my boots. I knelt and gently placed the little boat on the surface of the water. For a moment it bobbed in the shallows. Then a larger wave surged forward, lifting the boat and carrying it out into the surf. Ethan stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. We watched in silence as the small vessel was pulled by the relentless tide, growing smaller and smaller, a tiny speck against the vast, darkening ocean. We watched until it was completely swallowed by the immensity of the sea, disappearing into the twilight. It was a funeral for a toxic relationship that had defined me for too long, a funeral for the past that had held me captive, and a funeral for the old version of myself, the girl who had spent her entire life begging for a love that was never there. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon, I felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The weight was gone. The war was over. I was finally and completely free. Several years passed. The quiet, healing rhythm of my life in Oregon continued, steady and true as the tides. The past didn't vanish entirely, but it receded, its sharp edges worn smooth by time and distance. Becoming a faint, distant shoreline, I no longer felt compelled to look back on. Our wedding day was perfect because it was simple. There was no grand church, no elaborate reception. There was only the vast, windswept expanse of the Oregon coast, the salty air and the eternal sound of the Pacific waves crashing against the shore. I wore a simple white linen dress that danced in the breeze. Ethan wore his best flannel shirt. Our guests were a small, cherished circle of friends we'd made here. The people who knew me only as Anne, the woman who loved plants, and walked on the beach with the quiet carpenter. Standing barefoot in the sand, holding Ethan's warm, sturdy hands, I spoke my vows. They were not just for him. They were a promise to myself, a reaffirmation of the life I had fought so hard to build. Ethan, I began, my voice clear and steady against the roar of the ocean. I promise to love you, to honor you, and to cherish the life we have. But I also promise to be the fierce guardian of the peace we have built together. I promise to never again allow the shadows of the past to dim the light of our present. This peace is our home, and I will protect it with all that I am. As we exchanged rings, a flicker of movement on the coastal highway far above the beach caught my eye. A familiar beat-up sedan had pulled over to the shoulder. My heart didn't leap with fear, but with a strange, distant recognition. It was Claire's old car. A figure emerged from the driver's side. Even from this distance, I knew it was Vivian. She was just a silhouette against the gray sky, smaller and frailer than I remembered. She stood there alone, looking down at the small gathering on the beach. Ethan felt me tense, and his hand instinctively tightened around mine. A silent, protective gesture. He was ready to be my shield, to stand between me and the ghost on the hill. But I gave his hand a gentle squeeze and shook my head slightly. I wasn't afraid anymore. The woman up there held no power over me. She was no longer a monster in my mind, but a relic from another life, a photograph faded by the sun. Vivian stood there for a long time, a solitary spectator at the life she had thrown away. She didn't come down. She didn't try to cause a scene. Perhaps she came seeking a reaction, some final bit of drama to fuel her narrative. Or perhaps in a moment of quiet regret, she simply came to see what she had lost. Whatever her reason, she didn't find what she was looking for. After a few minutes, the small figure turned, got back into the car, and drove away, disappearing as quietly as she had arrived. I watched her go, not with anger or pity, but with a final, serene detachment. The ceremony continued. We were pronounced husband and wife. Our friends cheered, their happy voices carried away by the wind. And for the first time, I felt completely and utterly whole. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Ethan and I walked along the water's edge, hand in hand. The sky was a brilliant, impossible palette of pink and gold. I was no longer Sergeant Shore of the United States Marine Corps. I was no longer Vivian's discarded daughter. I was Mavis, a name I now wore with quiet pride. I was a wife, a friend, a survivor. I stopped walking and placed a hand on my gently swelling belly. A new life, a new promise, growing safely within me. I was going to be a mother, and I knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that I would be the kind of mother I had always deserved. True freedom, I realized, wasn't about escaping a person or a place. It wasn't about winning a fight or proving someone wrong. It was about the quiet, internal peace you build for yourself, brick by brick, day by day. It was the presence of love, the safety of trust, and the strength to protect that peace at all costs. I looked out at the vast, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. I hadn't been able to change my mother. I hadn't been able to fix my past, but I had managed to change my own world completely. And that was the only victory that ever truly mattered. My story, in the end, wasn't about running away. It was about running towards a life I deserved. It was about realizing that I had the right to build my own peace and protect it fiercely. And I know I'm not the only one who has had to make that choice. So many of us carry silent battles. If my story resonated with you, I hope you'll share your own thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and your voice deserves to be heard. Thank you for listening. For more stories of strength and survival, be sure to subscribe to the channel.